Hello, this section is entitled Configuring a VM for Stackdriver Monitoring and Logging, Part 1. And in this video, we're going to focus more on the cloud monitoring features of a VM that are not necessarily, they come out of the box and don't require installing anything. And then the next video will go into more about the specifics of this title. Okay? So cloud monitoring, if you remember, that's a system where we can have metrics, and some of the two main concepts that you need to get a good idea on here when you come to cloud monitoring is one is you have a concept of a resource. That's the thing that's being monitored, and then you have the metric, and that is the thing that you're monitoring essentially. And I think it's easy to see by example. So if I go into my project here, you can see under Compute Engine, I've already, before the video started, I just created 2 virtual machines just for illustration purposes. I didn't do anything special. And you can see I have 2 instances. So these are the actual resources, right? And if I was to go into one of these instances, there's actually a tab here called Monitoring. And you will get a series of charts here. And these charts, so each one of these essentially represents a different metric. In this case, CPU utilization is how much CPU I'm using. So you can see when I just started up a while ago, you can see it kind of was busy, and then it's now dropped down essentially idle. So the key here is the instance is the resource, and in this case, CPU utilization is the metric. Now it's useful that's sort of a high level of it. Under the hood, we need to kind of get a handle, if we're going to really get into this, there's a couple core concepts we need to understand. And the first concept is the concept of a time series. So a time series, there's essentially 3 parts to a time series. One is you have the resource that that the time series is about. So that's what this line is. Then you have the data itself. That's a series of time-stamped values, right? That's essentially what makes up your chart, right? And the third is a description of the metric itself, okay? And so I think the way we can see this is under the hood, we'll look at a structure of a resource, and then we'll look at a structure of a metric. So in this case, the resource is labeled GCE instance. That's the identifier for the resource type, right? And then the key here is that's a type of resource, and then to uniquely identify it, you have to supply 3 things, 3 labels. Which project, which zone, and what instance ID for the resource. And if you give all 3 of those of a GC instance type, you actually have a unique resource, right? And if you think about how we created our GC instances, that makes sense because we always have to supply a zone and a project, and then it gives us back a unique instance ID. Okay, so that's the resource. In this case, the metric here, on the other hand, it's basically this string right here. That is the metric. So that's essentially the identification for the metric. And a couple key things. It has this gauge and this double, which we'll talk about in a minute, right? And it applies to GC instances. And it itself actually has a label called instance name to uniquely identify it. So again, this is basically defining the metric itself. And then, of course, the third part of this is the actual data. Now, to understand this business about gauge and double, this is basically the type and kind. So the type is essentially the type of data that's in that time series, right? In the data. So you could have Boolean, integer, double, or string. In this case, this metric type, this metric definition is a double. Okay. Then the other kind of data way of describing a metric is the kind of metric, right? And in this case, there's 3 different kinds. One is called a gauge, and that's basically a metric that can go up and down, like a temperature, right? The temperature goes up, temperature goes down. That's what a gauge is. A delta basically the value of a delta metric is the difference from the previous value. So if you have a series of datas, it's basically the deltas between some other values, right? And then the last one is basically a monotonically increasing counter, so it's called a cumulative metric. And in this case, maybe like byte sent. So the next value is always higher than the previous one because you're just basically adding to some counter. Okay, so again, the key to this thing is we're going to be looking at time series, and then you need to understand that there's resources, there's metrics, and then there's the data itself. Now, I think the easiest way to see this is by example. So if I'm looking at this screen here, and I go to, let's see which button, Explore and Monitoring button. Let's look to see what this time series is what we're looking at now, what it looks like. And you can see, close this down, here's that same graph. Let's see if I can, of course it's zoomed out, so let me zoom in a little bit so I can see things. Okay, so there's the graph, right? The same graph we were looking at. But now you can see some of the structure to the left that's sort of what made this graph, right? So the resource type, that's the resource, right? Looking back at that, so that's actually, let's go back here. That is resource type. That's a GC instance here. And, no, actually that's the wrong one. GC instance is the type here, right? And it's displayed as a VM instance. Well, that's exactly what we see here, VM instance. And the metric is CPU utilization. That is this thing, right? Which displays as this, which is why we see this. So now, by picking those two things, we're narrowing down on, identifying a particular time series. And you can see that in this case, we're providing the three values of the labels. So remember, the labels for a resource, you uniquely identify it. You supply a project ID, zone, and instance ID. And you can see that that's what we're seeing here. So this is basically uniquely identifying that particular resource. And this is really, actually, I'm not sure why they added this, but that's actually the label from the metric itself. It doesn't hurt. If you get rid of it, it doesn't do anything. Because we're not really grouping things by that. So it's an unusual entry there. But basically, that is sort of when you start looking at this, you'll now understand why you see all these extra filters and such. Now, if you remember, we actually had two instances. So in this case, I can actually delete this entry right here. And now you can see that now I have two entries, right? Because I have two instances. And just to make this graph a little bit more clear, I'm going to get rid of this. I'm going to add a filter of the instance name, right? And then there's the instance 1 and instance 2. Okay, and they're both pretty much underutilized, and I guess that's not unexpected. So this is, basically exposing some of the structure of what makes up a time series as a combination of resource type, the metric, and then you filter down by picking labels of either the resource type or the metric to narrow down to precisely which time series you want to look at. By the way, this stuff is confusing, and I still struggle with it myself. One other thing we can do here is, I guess I'm going to have to zoom out some more to get it all on the screen. Just as an illustration, you can actually save this chart, right? And I'll leave the title the same. And I can create what's called a new dashboard, and I'll call this my dashboard. So you can save this for later, so you don't have to keep on recreating this thing. And let's look to see where this shows up. So this is about monitoring and actually dashboards. So if you recall, this is all part of the training monitoring workspace, right? Because in an earlier video, that's how we set up monitoring. And you can see there's my dashboard right here. And that dashboard has a single chart, which is the one we created. Now, interesting enough, you get a couple dashboards out of the box that might be useful. So I didn't create these. These came One, like the VM instance is created when I activated GCE, the Google Compute Engine. I actually got this dashboard, and you can see this lists out all of the instances I have. Then I can get an overview tab, which shows you the instances with the top CPU utilization. This top drop firewall traffic we're not going to worry about. Yeah, you get some data, you get some CPU, some kind of pre-canned charts that might be useful. Okay. Now, one thing you may be noticing here, actually, this is a kind of a tease for the next video, is you notice it said there's no data for this selected, like memory. This instance clearly is using memory, and yet we're not seeing data. And there's going to be a reason for that, and that's what the purpose of the next video is. So I think we'll stop this video here, and then we'll focus on how do we make these graphs do something. That's it.